Good evening, everybody. My name is David Shankland. I'm the chairman of the society, and it's very nice to be here. I apologise for being late. I've just been chairing another seminar, actually, on the development of anthropology in Wales. So this is quite a contrast, but nevertheless, both are fascinating topics. And I'm particularly interested in this because I don't think we have enough intellectual work, really. We don't feature enough intellectual work on the economic development, either historically or of contemporary society in Turkey and related areas. And so I'm sure we'll all learn a very, very great deal from our presenters tonight. So I think the best thing we can do really is to offer them the floor. Now, because of course as I say, and I apologize once more, I was late. I wasn't quite sure whether you're going to both speak together or in turns. How would you like to organize your talk this evening?
I am going to start. I'm going to start and then Costas will continue. I think you can hear me, right? I'm being heard. Well, there's no problem. Okay, no problem. I will start. I will also tell how we divided the discussion and then Costas will continue.
That's absolutely perfect. Well, please, Pinar, go ahead. The floor is yours. So we're listening.
Okay. Well, first I need to do the sharing. Start share. Okay. I'm trying to share my presentation with you. I think you're able to see it, right? Now everything is okay. All right. So first of all, thank you very much for being here tonight. And I'm really excited to share our work with all of you. As you all know, this is based on our book named Capitalism in the Ottoman Balkans, Industrialization and Modernity in Macedonia. I am going to be the one who's going to talk about the story side. Basically, I will tell you the story of these industrialists, and I will show you the nice maps and some of the drawings, etc. And then Costas will continue with introducing the economic importance, theoretical importance of this case study. Let me put the map so that you might have a view of the region. So basically this is our region. Here is Thessaloniki, Salonika, Selanik. It has hundreds of names thanks to the Balkan issues. And the region we are going to focus on is on the left of Thessaloniki, which maybe you can see from my computer, this Edessa, Naus and Veria region. But before going into what happened in this region, let's start with the discussions about industrialization, capitalist development in the Ottoman Empire, because this is relatively an under-researched topic in Ottoman studies. But also in studies regarding the development of capitalism or industrialization in general. And obviously the first analysis of the emergence of capitalism were on the experience of Britain and the West. Therefore, any latecomer like the Ottoman Empire could not escape from being analyzed from the framework of these first examples. Here, though, the Ottoman Empire, just like many other states of the East, has an extra disadvantage. That is the fact that the structure of the state, society, economy, politics, etc., are already quite different than the Western examples. So this putting the Ottoman Empire in the shoes of the West was quite unfair indeed. And there are serious differences even among the experiences of the Western states regarding their path to industrial capitalism, which requires a much deeper understanding and reading of how the specific state and its institutions were working. This requirement of understanding the specific state with its institutions and forces at work is even more when an empire like the Ottoman Empire is in question. Otherwise, it is impossible to escape from writing a story of the emergence of capitalism as a poor imitation of the story of the West. That's the main problem of the early studies on the emergence of capitalism in the Ottoman Empire. That is why our study starts with a case study. This is not a random case study, as I would give its significance and how well it is able to, let's say, reflect the Ottoman experience. But first, let me explain very quickly the sources we worked for this, we used for this work. Before we started this work, there was actually no academic literature on the topic existed, I mean, directly. Of course, there were very important academic works who mentioned that there was something important going on there, but there wasn't a specific study. So we have used very widely Ottoman archival sources. And these sources have been used first time in this study. We have provided the additional information from Greek sources. And finally, and very vital for our study, is that the information that has been derived from extensive fieldwork, including family histories, local institutions, buildings, physical monuments, and oral traditions of the region. So basically, these are the most original sources that we brought together on top of all the literature reading. So here you see on the map the city of Salonika. I am sure that like everybody who's interested in Ottoman studies has heard about Salonika, because it was one of the most significant port cities of the empire, a multicultural city, home to a big Jewish community, and it was even called Jerusalem of the Balkans, which was followed by Muslims and Greeks. And at the same time, in the 19th century especially, it was a connection point of the empire with Western Europe via sea and railway routes. And the city of Salonika was already a center of guild-based cloth production, textile production, since the arrival of the Sephardic Jews from Iberian Peninsula, because these Jews were given special rights, special concessions by the Ottoman states to produce woolen cloth for especially to supply the needs of the army, Ottoman army, or the Janissary Corps. But it wasn't the only source that was buying the textiles of Salonika. The Salonican textile producers, the Jewish producers, were also exporting all the way to Italy and France. So there was already a traditional guild-based production in Salonika. However, the collapse of this traditional guild-based textile production came with initially the penetration of Western goods with the beginning of the 19th century, roughly. The mechanized production, basically, which was much cheaper than these traditional ones, but also with the dissolution of the Janissary Corps in 1826 as well, because in a sense there was a huge demand loss, but at the same time, the Janissaries, who were the advocates of guild-style protectionism, due to their involvement in guilds, this protection was also lost. However, this region, interestingly, managed to recover throughout the 19th century and became the center of industrial production again towards the end of the 19th century. But this time, it was in a totally different manner. It was a fully capitalist manner, unlike the previous phase. Our case study does not focus on Thessaloniki, but it focuses on these, what we call Mount Vermion region, which is on the western part of Thessaloniki, in 3 towns, which you can see here: Edessa, Nausa, and Veria. And the most important among these 3 is Nausa, because we'll see that the industrial capitalists were originating from this town, and Costas will also discuss the reasons for this community aspect of this capitalist industrialization experience. I said that this is not a random case study, and it actually is quite significant within the industrialization experience of the Ottoman Empire, and I will give you some statistics regarding this. Ottoman Macedonia as a whole held the second largest concentration of industrial concerns in the empire towards the end of the 19th century, surpassed only by Istanbul, the capital, and its surrounding region. However, some significant names like Donald Courted also claimed that at the beginning of the 20th century, indeed, Macedonia possessed the largest industrial capacity and surpassed Istanbul already. It is really difficult to test this claim because we need to know the industrial capacity of Istanbul way more in detail, which we don't, unfortunately, at the moment. But even if it were false, and let's say Macedonia was the second one, this still makes Ottoman Macedonia a special case because it was the largest private industrial region in the whole of the empire, because the imperial capital, Istanbul basically benefited from the state investment, whereas in Salonika, what we see is purely private industrialization. And in Macedonia, the most dynamic region was the region of Mount Vermion with its three towns, Nausa, Edes, and Veria, which in 1912, which was the last year of the Ottoman Empire in this region of the Balkans, in 1912, this region could justifiably be described as the empire's main industrial hub for textiles. In 1913, basically 1912, just before the end of the Ottoman rule, this part of Macedonia possessed half of the empire's total cotton spinning capacity, and 2/3 of this half was situated in the region of Mount Vermion in these three towns I just mentioned. This is according to spindle numbers, according to spindles. When we talk about the woolen sector, woolen cloth making, the weight of provincial Macedonia is even clearer because first of all, the provincial Macedonia had a long and strong tradition in domestic manufacturing and the trade of good quality woolen cloth. But when we came to the beginning of 20th century, they also managed to mechanize this production. So there were 4 wool weaving mills in the European part of the empire, and all were situated in Thessaloniki and Nausa. And 3 out of these 4 was controlled by the capitalists from Nausa. So this, in terms of horsepower, this means 80% of the whole mechanized industrial capacity in woolen sector, and 90% of the employment was controlled by the industrialists who originated from Nausa. So we can say that significant textile industrialization emerged during the last decades of the empire, and much of it was based in Macedonia, and to a large extent, this industrialization was driven by the capitalists of this little town of Nausa. I can show you one of the most important factories of the region. This is the biggest, probably the biggest wool weaving mill and woolen cloth factory, basically, of the Ottoman Empire, and technically the most advanced one. This was founded in Nausa in 1907. As you can see, it's quite big, considering the conditions of the time, and it still exists. And recently, it was turned into an industrial museum for writing the history of now some industrialists and capitalists. Here we should also mention one thing, which is that Ottoman capacity, general capacity in cotton spinning and wool weaving in 1912 was still a very small part of the world capacity. So when we're talking about Ottoman industrialization, we're not talking about a state which was significant in global standards. However, the modest presence of the empire at the global level should not detract from the dynamism and significance of industrial capitalist transformation that took place in this part of Ottoman Macedonia, because by the standards of the empire, an economic revolution took place in this region of Mount Vermion, and much of it was originating from this little town of Nausa. So we believe that this is a story that needed to be told, and this is also a story that held the potential to give us certain clues about the general experience of the Ottoman state in this industrial era. So how I will continue is I will quickly summarize the story of industrialization in this region with a periodization and certain characteristics, then get into the question of why here. I will just summarize. I will give some bullet points explaining conditions that made this industrialization possible in this region. I won't go into details because I will give the floor to Costa after that, who will delve much deeper into the analysis of these conditions and their theoretical and economic significance. So, if we talk about the story of industrialization in the region of Mount Vermion, we start with 1870, which is when the first industrial activities emerged. We divide this period from 1870 until 1912, because that's the last year of the existence of Ottoman Empire in this region. We divide this whole period into 3 sub-periods. The first one is from 1870 to 1890, which we consider as the period of emergence of the first factories. In this first period, there was one failed application of Hagi Lazaros in 1872 for a woolen cloth factory. He basically wanted to mechanize woolen cloth production in the region, and this is quite an early attempt to do so, and a very ambitious attempt. But because of various reasons, basically mainly due to the fact that the Ottoman state was not ready, did not have the framework, legal or infrastructural framework to allow such a thing. This was not realized, but luckily Hagi Lazaros was insistent enough, and in 1907 he managed to found this area factory that I just showed you in the previous slide, this one. So actually it had to wait like 35 years, but in the end it became one of the most significant industrial plants of the empire. But in this first emergence period, one application managed to find its way into the heart of the Ottoman center, and the first factory in the region was founded. That was by 3 men, Longos, Kirchis, and Turpalis. These were the main shareholders, though there were other shareholders, but these 3 were the biggest shareholders. And this factory was founded in 1874. The story of the first mill is also interesting. This first mill, just like most of the other mills in the region, was water powered, using the abundant water sources of the region, which was for free, and employed mostly female workers, mostly very young girls, like as young as 6 years of age, for a very little salary, which gave the provincial mills a serious cost advantage, obviously. The spinning equipment of this first factory had been bought from a recently failed mill in Piraeus, in the Kingdom of Greece, whose owners had originally bought the machinery from Britain, but they couldn't realize their ambition of founding a factory. So it was almost unused second-hand equipment. Then the real story starts, because at the time the railways were not ready. The Ottoman railways were not active. So the equipment had been sent by boat to Salonika from the port of Piraeus, then had to be transported from Salonika to Nausa. If you see the map here, from Thessaloniki to Nausa by ox carts. And this is quite a muddy plain, and actually there are many uphill tracks as well. Then the spindles were installed by a Greek engineer who was brought from Patras, who probably also built the wooden turbine that was needed to turn the water into kind of activity. And Greek engineers continued to support the plants of the region, transferring their know-how, probably also training the workforce in the region. That's why this first factory, this first textile plant, was in a sense an industrial academy for the whole region, at which engineers and workers were trained. Showing these connections is important, since it underlines the significance of the communal character of the story, because as you might have noticed, the founders are all Greeks. They had the information about a failed factory attempt in the Kingdom of Greece, so they managed to buy it again from Greeks. They also brought Greek engineers, and they benefited from their know-how in founding this first factory. This first factory, first industrial plant, let's say, because it was small, we found this amazing drawing in the Ottoman archives. And the first time I was visiting Nausa, at some point you're driving uphill to the town, and at some point on the road I saw exactly the same image, despite the fact that there were so many others around, and that was a really emotional moment for me. This is the drawing of the first industrial plant. As you see, the water sources are clearly drawn, because the use of water was very important in both in the creation, but also in giving cost advantage to these industries. But it also has a different aspect, because how the use of water is going to be controlled was a serious issue from the perspective of the Ottoman Empire as well, because there were fields who were waiting for this water underneath, and if this affects the agriculturalists of the region, then there was going to be a clash. So the Ottoman Empire, the state, basically didn't want this kind of clash. So the proper running, the proper use of water was very important. And this was solved by an engineering, let's say, by creation of engineering here, where they use the water, but after they use the water, as you can see, somewhere between the buildings, the water is directed, it's diverted basically towards the factory. But after they return the water back to its source, in order not to affect the use of water by the agriculturalists. So the first industrial period, as I said, was very difficult, but also was very determining. In the second period, which we divided from 1890 till 1902, and we call this a takeoff period, because there were three new mills emerged in the region, one in Nausa, one in Edessa. Let me show the map again. One was in Nausa again. So it was the second industrial plant in Nausa. One was in Edessa, and the third one was in Veria. The one in Veria is not directly our concern, because it wasn't a direct involvement of the capitals from Nausa, but still one of the three main shareholders was from Nausa, who probably involved in this industrial plan by giving his know-how. And again, this was not known. We found this in the Ottoman archives in the list of shareholders. Let me go here. Three new mills were founded, but at the same time, the first mill of Longos, Kirtis, and Turpales, whose drawing I just showed, it upgraded its capacity, and it also expanded into cloth making in this region. So within 20 years, basically, it already had the need to upgrade its capacity and also expand into cloth making only from spinning yarn. Here, one interesting thing is the first mill of Edessa, which was known as Vodina in the Ottoman times, because this is not coincidental, and it shows another aspect of the industrialization here. And this has to do with the arrival of the railways in 1894. The arrival of the railways put Edessa in a very favorable position in the region, because the railway station was very close to the center of the town, which gave it a transportation ease and cost advantage. This is an interesting case, because Ottoman Railways was built by a standard contract between the state and the railway builders, charging the state per kilometer of rail. Therefore, the railway lines were drawn in a way to minimize the cost without much considering the accessibility of the station from the nearest town. That's why railways, especially in the Balkans, is quite notorious in this sense. And this is the case for Nausa, for instance, unlike in Edessa. That's why the emergence of this first mill in Edessa is important. But secondly, Edessa is the center of waterfalls in the region, which means it has access to fast-running, abundant and steady water supply that is crucial for a water-powered textile plant. As I said before, this mill in Veria was not directly an investment of the capitals of Nausa, but still a family from Nausa was instrumental in its foundation, and probably as a provider of know-how, because they already had some experience from Nausa and Edessa. Here, so in the last period, which is from 1902 until 1912, as I said before, the last year of Ottoman existence in this region, we call it the peak period. Here, I will show you the list of industries you can see. You don't have to, of course, focus on the names, and these are not the only shareholders anyways. The names were given according to the biggest shareholders. And this last period is quite a peak period indeed, because 7 new textile plants were built in this period, 3 of which were in cotton, the remaining 3 in wool, and 1 plant was founded, but it didn't start its operations until the end of the First World War. But at the same time, many of the existing plants increased their capacities and or also extended their operations into cloth making. There was quite a lot of activity in this period. And the capitals from Nausa also transcended the limits of their local region and became more active in the economy of Salonika. As you can see, for instance, they founded factories in Salonika as well. In 1909, Turpalis went to Salonika and found, he established another factory there despite the disadvantages of Salonika. And again, in woolen textiles, Turpalis with Kazazis, in 1911, they also found a woolen textile plant in Salonika. In this period, one of the very important developments was the fact that banking and financial facilities became more established, aiding the financial needs of the industrialists. Technical and operational know-how of industrial production improved, obviously. And another very important aspect is that the state's attitude and policies turned in favor of the industrialists. Finally, after decades, the state was more, let's say, consciously supporting the industries. In this last period, from 1902 to 1912, which we call the peak period, the most important, the most significant development was basically the expansion into woolen textiles, especially the foundation of area. This one I showed you was very important because it was probably the largest woolen mill in the whole empire and technically the most advanced one. Much of its production was for the supply of the Ottoman gendarmerie. So you see 100 years difference, but a kind of continuation in their relation with the state and how they supplied the needs of the state. It is in this period that we can call that the Macedonian countryside was becoming an industrial economy as well. Of course, this doesn't mean that the agriculture had stopped. It was still the dominant activity, but after the experience of this period, the Macedonian countryside can legitimately be called an industrial economy as well. So this is a very short story of these industries. Then comes the question of, then why here? Like, why in these 3 small towns? Why now some capitalists? Why? What was special about these people? So I will just summarize some of our foundings. Basically, here we are drawing a framework of conditions from macro level to micro level, which gave way to a successful industrialization experience within Ottoman limitations, let's say. So the first one we should take into account is the, let's say, the global conditions. Among the global conditions, one very significant one is free trade policies, especially after the Anglo-Ottoman Trade Convention of 1838. Here, you can see in this slide, Ottoman foreign trade change from 1830s until 1913. It is the annual average in £1,000,000 sterling. As you see that there was a huge increase both in export and imports. But why is this important? Because we are talking about a group of merchants who were becoming industrialists. So obviously their activities in trade gave them a good investment that was required for the industrial plants later on. Here, the geographical location of Salonika at the junction of various routes connecting the Ottoman Empire to Western Europe was also quite important. And a further important factor was that the vilayet of Salonika, the region of Salonika, possessed very powerful productive forces both in agriculture and manufacturing, and was also home to a very well-established merchant class. This means that the merchants of the region managed to accumulate the capital, as I said, very much needed for their industrial investments later, and built also a network of production and trade. This Costas will go deeper into details of merchant becoming industrialist debates. But there's another factor, which is here we will see. This is industrial development in Vilayet of Salonika from 1880 till 1910. This is also a period at these 1870s onwards. If we think about the developments in the global economy, this is also a period when the first industrialized countries basically begun to move up the ladder, meaning they were moving on to producing the machinery for textiles rather than producing the textiles. So latecomer countries like the Ottoman Empire were just starting their industries with the basic products like you see here: textiles, food processing, consumer durables, etc. Whereas the first developed countries, first industrialized countries, were moving into more sophisticated industrial branches. So this also has an impact here. The second point I want to mention is the role of the Ottoman state. And the role of the Ottoman state was actually quite complex because we see a very controlling state trying to encourage private industrial investment after the state's default in 1875. But despite its willingness to let's say encourage this kind of investment, because they didn't have money, basically the state didn't have any money to continue investing in state industrialization. There was no standard and well-established procedure for or a framework for founding a private mill, and this we see in the application from the Ottoman archives again, in the application procedure of the first mill in 1874. It was quite a long process. There was it's quite a long correspondence, basically back and forth. The state is asking for extra documents. The industry is asking for a bit of concessions, and it was very long correspondence, which also shows that at the time in 1874-75, the state didn't still have much idea about the requirements of a private industrial plant and what kind of a framework the state needs to draw in order to encourage such investments. Only after 1902, again from the correspondences that we have found in the Ottoman archives, we see that only after 1902 the administrative procedure for starting an industrial project for industrial investment was finally settled. Until then, it was still quite unsure and changing very, very often. In here, the state's role in general industrialization is quite complex, because on the one hand, we see that the state is supportive and flexible in certain issues, while on the other hand, we see a very authoritarian, very bureaucratically frustrating actually, and an intrusive state, which made the applications quite difficult for the industrialists. But another aspect is quite important for me. That was the discrimination that was made by the state as well. Because even when the procedure or the framework to found an industrial plant was pretty much set, the state always held the exclusive right to distribute extra incentives or extra concessions. And in our case, this is quite significant, quite obvious when we make the comparison between the Greek capitalists of the Macedonian countryside, Nausa and the Severia region, versus the Jewish capitalists, Jewish industrialists of Salonika. According to these archival correspondences, we see that Jewish capitalists of Salonika, who had much better connections and personal, basically, connections with the Sultan and the Ottoman state, had always been backed by and supported by the state. And these Greek capitalists of the countryside were also aware of this. This we understand again from their correspondences, because they were in their correspondences with the central state, they were openly asking to benefit from the same state support that the Salonican industrialists were benefiting. But they didn't get it. And despite they didn't get it, towards the end of this period, actually, they managed to become bigger industrialists in textile sector than the Salonican ones. Another important aspect is obviously economic advantages. So what were the economic advantages that made these industrial capitalists, these industrialists of the countryside, more successful than the rest? Let me show this first of all. Okay, this is a list of Greek merchant families from the town of Nausa, according to their commercial activity. In the archival sources and also in the field work and family histories, etc., we know that pretty much all these families who were merchant families before became industrialists later on. They were at least the shareholders in industrial plants. So this brings us to the first and very important point, which is these people had the know-how of woolen cloth making and its trade. Traveler accounts from the beginning of the 19th century even typically mention this region, this Nausa, Veria, Edessa region, as a place of intense commercial activity, which is also confirmed by the Ottoman sources, by the way. And the main export of Nausa, the town of Nausa, was shayak. Shayak is a high quality woolen cloth that was widely used to make traditional clothes. And the production of shayak required steady supply of good quality wool, which existed in Nausa thanks to the shepherds of Mount Vermion, and abundant supplies of fast-flowing water for the fulling process of the wool. Ottoman sources also recorded that Veria and Nausa provided high-quality textiles to the capital Istanbul and its environs, as well as to the Kingdom of Greece. We see again a connection with the Kingdom of Greece from a much earlier period. So the know-how of traditional textile production as well as its trade existed in this region. And Greek merchants was one of the most significant ones, in one of the most significant groups in these merchandise networks, which is, you can see all the Greek merchants of the region in this list. And as I said, this is later on confirmed by the Ottoman sources as well. But again, when we look at the shareholders of the industrial plants, we see pretty much exactly the same names, which is another proof confirming that this is a case, theoretically speaking, where merchant is becoming industrialist. But there are other advantages of this region, which was one, the region had abundant water sources to use in water-powered plants for free, whereas the Salonican competitors of these industries were using electricity, which wasn't for free, obviously. And they had good raw materials from the region, both cotton and wool, and cheap workforce, which was much cheaper than Salonika, because in Salonika, the unions were very well organized and quite strong, whereas there was no such thing in Nausa. Towards the end of the period, there emerged certain unionization attempts in Nausa as well, but the trade unions were never strong in the countryside as compared to Salonika. And obviously proximity to a railway and sea routes, both for the rest of the empire, to send their products to the rest of the empire, and also to Western Europe, is also important. The last point I'm going to make, and then I will give the floor to Costas to delve deeper into these advantages from an economic and theoretical perspective, is the communal character, which I have already mentioned slightly. All the industrial families of Nausa belong to the Christian Greek upper social layer of Mount Vermion, which is also known as Çorbacı of the region. They benefited from the Greek community network, both inside and outside of the empire, as I have given some examples of. Ties among them were not only cemented through communal networks, but also through intermarriages. So many of them were also relatives, as you see in the main picture, the photograph on the book. This is three big industrial families who also have marriage ties. And this meant that these all together created mechanisms of trust and monitoring of economic activities, made trust much easier, and they also managed to monitor economic activities easier. And furthermore, the family and community networks of the Çorbacı established access and control over capital, land, commercial networks, and market information, which was quite vital to the industrial transformation of the region. This is basically all I have to say. I will give the floor to Costas, and in the question and answer time, I'm happy to answer and give more details about anything I have said here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Fascinating. Good. Well, let's we pass to our second speaker. Thank you for that wonderful start.
Thanks.
You can take the thing off, Pinar.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Stop share. There you are.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation from my side too. Pinar was very thorough and methodical. So you've got the picture from the, as it were, the archives and the detailed historical research we undertaken. I want to base myself on that, and she's made life easier because I can be quick on certain issues. And in a sense, draw the bigger picture. Let me share, or try and share, my PowerPoint too. Now, I can be quick to begin with. and I can be quick because Pinar has covered it. How to approach the question of industrial capitalism in late Ottoman Macedonia? Well, as was said, we did a study in Ottoman economic history. In other words, we approached it, first of all, away from the notion of decline, which of course historians do not accept anymore today, and they haven't accepted for a long time, that this was somehow a society in decline for several centuries. We approached differently, and we saw it from within. We attempted to examine the forces from within, as it were, that led to the emergence of industrial capitalism where it did. As Pinar said, it wasn't dramatic and it wasn't across the board, but it was important where it happened. So we approached it from within. The second thing we did was to approach it as, again, Ottoman, in other words, neither Greek nor Turkish. A lot of the historiography, as you know, tends to look at those events with the eyes of the present. It's as if people were expecting and waiting for today to emerge, and while they were doing that, they were hanging on or not getting on with their everyday lives. Well, they were. And really, to understand what happened, you've got to approach it with Ottoman eyes, as it were. And that's what we try to do. But beyond that, we attempted to have a study in the political economy of development. We were interested in why you get capitalism spontaneously igniting, as it were, in certain parts of the world and not in others. Why in that part of the empire, and why so late compared to other parts of the world? What led to this kind of the igniting of capitalist development, and what contributed to that in an era in which there was ostensibly liberal politics, but not so free trade. And it is this that I want to spend a few minutes on. Now, as again Pinar has said, and I can be quick, it's a case study. So it's quite narrow in a way, but it is an appropriate case study because obviously, as was shown before, Macedonia, Salonika, and the region of Mount Vermian were actually at the forefront of that kind of development in the Ottoman context during the last 4 decades of the existence of the empire. I want to stress that the empire remained an overwhelmingly agrarian economy, even in Macedonia. I will discuss agriculture in a minute. It remained an overwhelmingly agrarian economy, but there were strong pockets of capitalism within it, including textiles, much more, and trade as well. And the epicenter of this, for our purposes, and therefore the epicenter of modernity, because capitalism and modernity go together, was Macedonia. All you've got to do is refer to the Young Turks, and then it becomes clear that there was something going on in Macedonia which was deeper and more complex than elsewhere in the empire. And that's what we'll try to grasp. Now, we'll look at textiles, and I want to discuss the economics of textile capitalism a little bit more deeply, and then I will look at the social forces and the communities and the people who were behind this. What are the economics of it? Well, actually, the story, once you get close to it, is straightforward. And Pinar has given you several of the concrete elements of it. Really, the story begins, the story of the overall capitalist development begins, as we know, in the second quarter of the 19th century. And there are two things that take place there of crucial importance for the empire generally, but for Macedonia in particular. The first is the liberalization of the domestic market, an opening of the domestic market, what we would call today deregulation, or liberalization of the domestic market imposed from outside, as I will explain. The second event that went with that was, of course, suppression of particular interests, the suppression of the guilds in particular, but other sectional interests that were preventing the liberalization of trade domestically and the liberalization of economic activity domestically. And there are three landmark events here, of course. The first is the destruction of the Janissaries in 1826. And of course, the Janissaries were not a military force of any consequence by that time. They were basically traders and small business people and so on, but armed and politically influential. So the destruction of the Janissaries lifts an important domestic impediment to liberalization of the market. The second is the Treaty of Baltalimanu in 1838, whereby the English Navy, as it did elsewhere, imposed terms of trade liberalization, and in a way confirmed what had happened in 1826 and opened up further avenues. And of course, the third is the Tanzimat 1839, a declaration, more than anything, but an important declaration, which began the process of lifting not only economic controls, but here social controls, and opening up a path towards capitalist development, the real transformation of the empire. Now, what happened after that, certainly from the 1840s onwards, is very interesting. When you look at textiles, which is the industry that matters to us. Now, obviously, we all know that until then, the Ottoman world had a very long-standing tradition of excellent quality textiles, differing in particular areas, of very high quality and sufficient to meet domestic demand. It wasn't really a world that imported textiles from abroad. Well, liberalization changed all that because, of course, Lancashire intervened, and British cotton goods destroyed the domestic market, destroyed the domestic industry. Didn't take long. It was actually quite a rapid process. The destruction of domestic industry was a seismic event in the Ottoman economic context, because obviously it changed entire areas and entire cities and so on. For us, for our story, and for the emergence of capitalism, what matters here is that despite the generalized destruction of these economic activities, the textile activities, because of British imports, niches remained, and that's what matters. Destruction is never complete when it comes to these things, when you open the world market. Niches remained, and these niches, these market niches, were actually, interestingly enough, related to traditional clothing. In other words, they were connected to the customs of the people, the very varied people of the Ottoman Empire, of course. That meant, again, in our context, Aba and Shayak. Fairly rough woolen cloth in the first place, and better quality woolen cloth in the second case. These were fundamental textiles for traditional clothing, and traditional clothing was very much dominant for a long period. Frankish clothes were not what you would wear by and large. That allowed the survival of in a kind of proto-industry and a putting out system dominated by textile merchants who would organize activity locally and meet the needs of the domestic population that wanted to wear traditional clothes. That allowed for the survival of some textile capacity, which was very important, and trading in textiles, which was also important. A lot of it had to do with the army as well, because the army would require that kind of cloth. Now, this is the reality of textile production and trading in large parts of the Balkans, including in Macedonia and including in the town of Nausa. What happens in the 1860s, in the 1870s, however, is a real leap. And this is what we wanted to capture. This is in a sense, this when industrial capitalism, in a sense, self-ignites. A real leap took place, and that is related to global events. The growth of trade that Pinar mentioned, that had been going on for decades, but crucially in this time, the American Civil War, which changed relative prices and made the raw cotton expensive in England. In that context, in the 1870s, the textile manufacturers and traders of Macedonia made a vast jump into cotton spinning. Now, I want to stress, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with textile production. Working with wool is one thing, working with cotton is a very different thing. So it was actually a major shift that these people made. And they did it, of course, based on their existing experience in textiles, but they had to change their entire operations. And in that, they were supported by state policy. State policy had already begun to change by the 1870s. And that meant, in the narrow case of NASA, preferential tax treatment. They would actually import equipment preferentially. What was the market? The market was domestic. In other words, this was capitalism that focused on the domestic market, not exports. And the domestic market was interesting. English cottons dominated. English yarn also dominated. However, the peasants who engaged in domestic textile production, domestic weaving, mostly based on wool, also needed to use cotton thread, coarse cotton thread, because woolens that have got some cotton thread in them are much better lasting. That was the market. That was the market. The textile producers, textile traders and producers, woolen textile traders and producers shifted towards producing coarse cotton thread for the domestic market, which was provided by peasants. It's astonishing if you think about it. In a way, it's a kind of, you know, every time you discover America, it's just thrilling for the people who do it as the first crossing of the Atlantic, and that's basically what happened in that area. Now, the story afterwards, Pinar has given you the details, was striking. Within 4 decades, the transformation was enormous. Starting from a small plant that produced coarse cotton thread for the domestic local peasant market, they became significant players in Macedonia, and they could compete with imports. They had a presence in Salonika. They had several plants at their disposal. They had become significant players in the textile field, as I will explain further in a minute. Before I tell you about these people, then I want to stress the role of the state. And I want to do that because it's an important part of our book. The Ottoman state has got a bad press for a very long time, obviously. And when we say the Ottoman state, obviously the Ottoman Empire lasted centuries. Which Ottoman state? For us, what mattered is the Ottoman state towards the last few decades of its existence. And that's a very different state to before. It's a state that tries to modernize within certain conditions. It understands that it is militarily deficient and tries to meet the needs of pressure from outside. It effectively is a semi-colony and wishes to deal with that. So restructuring and re-centralization, the period of loss of central control during the rise of the Ayans before it had come to an end, the state re-centralizes power, and that is crucial in restructuring and promoting industrialization. Once they had come to realize that subordination to Western powers through the treaties that I mentioned was not going to allow domestic industry to rise. So some measure of promotion of private industry begins in the 1860s and the 1870s. There's a difference that occurs at that time, mostly expressed through tax privileges, but also in other ways. And that matters for the period that we're looking for, the area we're considering, although it was a provincial area. So these were not the prime beneficiaries of state policy compared, say, to Istanbul capitalists. The crucial thing to realize here is that there is no free market capitalism at that time. Yes, capitalism spreads. Yes, there is liberalism, but there are import controls and trade controls by the state across the board, even in developed countries. And that's what the Ottoman state also does, and that's how it supported industry. Now, who were the capitalists? What was the capitalist class then? We've already said they were merchants. They had international connections. They traded internationally. They had peasant origins. They were Christians. And they had a Greek public culture. They might have come from a variety of ethnic origins, but they had a Greek public culture. They were very different from the Salonika capitalists, who were Jewish. They did not have agricultural roots at all. Very different types of capitalist class. These merchants controlled information. They had the information that is necessary for the shift that took place in the 1870s. They controlled energy, that was crucial to production, cheap energy, basically the access to water. And they controlled access to technology. They developed ways of obtaining technology, mostly secondhand. They also had power over their community related to the church. A picture conveys 1,000 words, and here they are. This is the picture from the cover of our book. That's exactly the class that we're talking about. This is a picture taken in the 1820s, so after the Ottoman rule, the period of the Ottoman rule, but all of them made their money in the Ottoman period. They are actually, these are the people we're talking about. And there are 3 or 4 families here. They're the leading families. They're outside one of the major plants. They're married to each other. They coexist, and they are certainly a distinctive and exclusionary social group. They're obviously bourgeois in outlook, and they're obviously provincial. It is manifest that they're provincial, and they never, that's where they were in outlook. They are people of work by and large, but they accumulated money and they started acquiring different habits. Now, you can compare that picture with this. The difference is obvious, I think, visually. These are also the capitalist class of the time. This is Pericles and Cleon Hadjilazaros, the Hadjilazari family that Pinar mentioned, the people who established the area plant. But here they are in Salonika, because they were also important Salonika capitalists, Salonika bourgeois. And you can tell the difference. They are far better connected to the more advanced and more sophisticated ambience of Salonika. But their origins are from Vermia. Their origins are still from that area that we've been discussing. Now, I can give you more visual evidence of what it meant. Here is a piece of commercial correspondence that we were very fortunate to acquire, to find. A very rare piece of commercial correspondence from 1872. As it happens, it is written by my great-great-grandfather. And it is a piece of commercial correspondence whereby he deals with his partner in the south, in the Peloponnese. And you can tell from the evidence that there's a putting out system in place, and that trading in Shayak was the foundation of textile activity locally. But it's clear that we're talking about the bare beginnings in 1872. Within 40 years, this would look very, very different in the way it's structured, in the way the enterprises stand, and so on. This is the very beginning of capitalist activity. And I will also show you the picture of someone else, one of the people that Pinar mentioned. I think arguably he is the most active and energetic of the local capitalists, Georgios Kirtsis, an extraordinary man who became also a very rich man, one of the richest people in Macedonia, who became established in Salonika. He understood what cheap energy means, waterfalls mean, like all good capitalists, and he pushed for the spreading of textile production on a capitalistic basis from Nausa to Edessa. Kirtsis was an unfortunate man in his personal life because he lost 6 of his sons in the outbreak of the Spanish flu in 1918. But these are the unfortunate events of life. In any case, you can tell just by looking at him the type of people who led this kind of activity. I know time is getting short, so I'm going to push on. Just one last thing I want to show you to get a sense of the kind of activity we're talking about. This is a very rare piece of publicity, advertising effectively, for the main plant, the Longos, Kirtsis, and Turpalis plant that Pinar mentioned. And this is done after the refurbishment of the plant in 1902, which you can see in its drawings down there. You can see the size of it and the pride that they take. What is striking is the range of languages used. You can see this is Ottomanism most vividly, even in the case of industry. There's Greek, there is French, there is Russian, there is Hebrew and Arabic. There is no English, and why would there be in those days? Now, 2 more things I'm going to say, and then we can bring it to an end. I said that agriculture was very important in the Ottoman context. It was essentially an agrarian economy, and it remained so. And so was the local area. Capitalism, industrial capitalism, was certainly crucial, but the area remained agrarian in outlook to the very end. The transformation of agriculture was very interesting and gives you a sense of why industry had difficulties in developing faster than it did. And the reason is the persistence of chieflik land ownership. The area of Macedonia that concerns us, actually most of the Macedonian plain for centuries, was the Vakf of Gazi-Evrenos Bey. It's a vast area effectively belonging to the Evrenos family. And the Vakf collapsed, as they did in the 19th century, and then chieflik emerged. Chieflik agriculture is very peculiar, and it isn't conducive to capitalist agriculture. It is commercial, you produce for the market, but it isn't conducive to capitalist agriculture, to capitalist innovation. What is interesting is that in the area of Nausa, a large part of the chieflik ownership was in Christian hands. It's unusual because most of the chieflik owners were basically Muslim-based. A lot of them were Albanian in origin, but a large part of the in the local area were Christians. And you can see from the table we've constructed here that a lot of the Christians were actually industrialists. So what happened was that industrialists and merchants made money in Shayak and in cotton spinning, and then bought land. And when they bought the land, they were not capitalist farmers. They were çiftlik owners. They would make profits by using the çiftlik in the standard way. Now, again, time is very short. I want to say a few words about the working class. The working class of the provincial Macedonia were women, young girls, and children, nimble fingers. It holds in Macedonia as it holds everywhere when it comes to textile capitalism. Their origins were agrarian. They came from local villages. There were young girls working before marriage, essentially to create a dowry. Eventually, of course, a larger working class emerged, and now had the substantial working class. This was different from the Jewish working class in Salonika, because the Jewish working class in Salonika did not have agrarian origins. The Jewish workers of Salonika were actually original proletarians, urban people. Exploitation was very heavy. Wages were a third of Salonika wages, which were already low. Working hours were very long, and organization was poor. There isn't much worker activity in Nausa or in the surrounding area when it comes to that. Here's a picture that gives you a sense of what was happening. This is again from the 20s, but it wouldn't have been different in Ottoman times. You can see young girls and children producing, basically. Now, most of them were Christians, overwhelmingly. They were from the Christian community, in Greek in outlook, public culture. The power that came necessary for capitalism came from the church and came from command over local authority. Class differentiation was very harsh. The layer of the Çorbaji was dominant. It was exclusionary, as I said, and harsh in its class outlook. There was political struggle, however, that needs to be studied. Someone should do that work. There was political struggle. In a sense, the lack of overt social struggle translated into political struggle. And that was about command over local authority power. Who would command the local authority power, which Christians were allowed to exercise in the last few decades of Ottoman power. And that's how political tensions and political divisions manifested themselves within the Çorbaji group and between workers and industrialists. I want to end with a counterfactual now, because I know it's late and time's getting on. The period came to an end in 1912. It came to an end not from within, I want to stress. It came to an end from without. Ottoman rule in Macedonia did not collapse because it was a revolution, although it was highly unstable. It collapsed because it was impacted from the outside, the Balkan Wars, which no one expected the Balkan powers to win, incidentally, other than the Balkan powers themselves. But they did. And Ottoman rule collapsed. Complete transformation after that. Totally different arrangements, totally different framework. State borders were created, different markets, different relation to the state, and so on. What is interesting to speculate about is, could things have turned out differently? Let us suppose for a minute that there was no Balkan War, and there was Balkan Wars, and there were no, the First World War did not happen. Counterfactuals are like that. Could it have been different? Could there have been an Ottoman capitalist and an Ottoman working class? Could there have been some kind of capitalist development that would have resulted in a different direction of history? It's interesting to speculate on that, because again, we try to see this with Ottoman eyes, not Greek or Turkish eyes, but Ottoman eyes. Could it have been different? It's possible. One can think of that. It's possible, although the hurdles were enormous. And the hurdles were enormous because Ottoman society itself, despite the enormous space covered in the last few decades of its existence, was still riven with profound divisions. And it is very difficult to see how homogenization would have emerged, the necessary homogenization for capitalism. Very difficult to see what would have been the basis on which this would have happened. Without such homogenization, it's also very difficult to see how the state could have continued promoting the policy that was needed to succeed on the world scale. It's very difficult to see how they could have replicated what Japan did, for instance, or what the other powers did during that period. So the counterfactual is interesting, and our study gives you some further food for thought on this. My conclusion, our conclusion when we look at it, is that it would have been very difficult to continue and create a kind of Ottoman capitalism, even in the absence of wars. But we will never know. So thank you very much for your attention. I know it's been very long. We hope we've kept your interest, and hopefully you will have, there'll be some questions, some discussion now.
Well, thank you very much indeed for an extraordinarily rich and careful paper. If only all the papers that we received were you know, in general in academic life were so beautifully presented, I think that we would be even happier in our chosen professions, because that really was a very beautiful presentation. I'm sure there's lots and lots we can talk about, but one thing that absolutely fascinates me is that for much of your paper, I thought that you were putting forward what might be called an antithesis argument to the main theories of Aishubura. And they're, for me, the ones I've always found completely convincing about the development of capitalism in the 19th century Ottoman Empire. It's quite a long time since I read her work, but my very, very strong memory, and here you must correct me, is that what she is saying is that you couldn't get the development of capitalism in the 19th century Ottoman Empire. One, because the bureaucrats simply didn't understand the way that an economy works. Two, that they were very, very, very careful not to lose any power over anybody. And so that the moment any form of proto-business emerged that looked like it might be successful, they would be suspicious, they wouldn't want it to have any independence, and they would change the rules, in effect, under which they had to operate. And thirdly, of course, to become a businessman or entrepreneur or whatever you want to call it was simply not something that any Ottoman would do. I.e., by that, of course, I mean Turkish Ottoman would do. And so it meant there was always a kind of tendency to see this as coming from the outside. Now, the second two parts of my argument, of course, are not entirely convincing, because you've got the emergence of Jewish entrepreneurs in Europe, precisely under very, very similar conditions. On the other hand, I always did find the idea that the state retains control by having the power to change the rules and is suspicious of business. I did find that one convincing. And she traces this story right up to the modern day. And it is indeed the case in Turkey today that if you're running a business, you need to have links to the local authorities and indeed the national authorities, because they will pass rules against you, however big you are, unless you know exactly what favors to give them in order not to have these rules passed against you. And we're seeing this today with regard to very, very large holdings in Turkey, down to even very, very small ones when they get attacked by the local municipalities. So let's take this back, this Aishubura thesis, and put it into the context of Macedonia, which I'm sure you've done. I'm just rehearsing the argument, perhaps for those who have not looked at her book recently. Well, we've got the obvious point, is that it's quite a long way from Istanbul. So, it's perfectly possible that by the time you get the Ottoman bureaucracy in Macedonia already perhaps struggling a bit with regard to the wider problems in the empire, they simply just don't have the capacity to restrict the development of business in this way. in any easy way anyway. And secondly, of course, it might be rather convenient from the point of view of the Ottomans, because presumably local travel obviously is bad, but it's not so bad that they cannot get the wool and the textile produce from Macedonia to Istanbul fairly quickly. I mean, presumably there was a trade route which worked. But on the other hand, it was pretty much at the edge of the functioning empire at that point. And so maybe it was far away not to cause them too much worry about the emergence of independent capitalism in that area. And of course, looking at it from the other point of view, they were closer to an increasingly developed Europe. And it's not a coincidence that it happened in Macedonia, and it didn't happen in the Arabian provinces, for example. There's simply, if you look at the comparative economic development of the two regions of the time, of course, they were like chalk and cheese. So that's rather a long comment, but in essence, we can say, how do you understand your work interpreted against the Bura thesis? I would be very, very interested to what you say about that. Thank you very much.
Good question. Maybe Pinar would like to start, and I will bring up the rear.
Okay, I will start then. Okay, the analysis of Ayşe Bura, I particularly like her works on Polanyi, but in this case, her analysis is one of the earlier examples that we had mentioned. So they don't generally include archival work. I think that's the main problem, because without the existence of archival work, we didn't even know how big these industries were, how significant they were, how many spindles they had, how many workers they had. We didn't even know any of these. So Ayşe Bura's work belongs to the generation of works which were generally influenced from the Western theories and was trying to put the whole empire into a more, let's say, big theory viewpoint, in my opinion. And the biggest problem in this generation of works, the absence of archival work, because without archival work, you are bound to make generalizations without knowing the details of places like Macedonia. So that's my comment about that. And the second thing is, I think this distance of Macedonia from Istanbul is also a correct point, because it was near enough, or let's say well connected enough, to be able to send its products to a market like Istanbul, which was obviously quite big and important, especially in the case of, as we said, this woolen cloth factory of Hagi Lazaros area, which was sending the clothes for the police forces, gendarmerie of the Ottoman state. So it was well connected enough to be able to make such trade, but it was far enough to escape from certain immediate, let's say, controls of the state as well. So I totally agree on this point. That's it. Costas, you can continue.
Yeah.
Just before, well, I don't want to, can I just clarify something with you before we go to Costas? And so when you looked at the archives, did you not find any information that led you to think that the Ottoman state was interfering with the operations?
Of course,
in Macedonia?
Of course. I mean, you can find many such examples in the book as well. I didn't get into details here because they're very, very detailed. But yes, of course, Ottoman state was very intrusive, very, very controlling, especially in the first two periods, especially. I will just give you one example. So one of the first legal frameworks that the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman state ever passed regarding the foundation of an industrial plant was a tax exemption for the imported machinery that was absolutely necessary for the foundation of an industrial plant. So these lists still exist in the archives. When you look at the list, all you will see is red marks, because obviously an engineer who, we don't know if he was informed enough to understand from what an industrial plant requires, or like a woolen cloth factory requires, was just sitting down and deleting certain items, saying these are not absolutely necessary, these are not absolutely necessary, in order to delete certain items from the tax exemption list. So the state was very, very controlling in that sense, but still was there somehow success in industrialization? Yes, it still managed, let's say. Some still managed to found their factories.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's right. And I would actually be a bit more positive than that, because the role of the state is very interesting. Actually, if you look at the history of the emergence of capitalism in England and elsewhere, the state is always there. It always plays a role. Even when people talk about private capitalism and so on, actually the state is always there. It was there in England in a variety of ways, going all the way back to the Navigation Acts of the 17th century. The Ottoman state, however, is a peculiar case, and we've indicated why. It isn't only that it had an anti-capitalist or an anti-industrialist outlook, which is debatable, and as I will say in a minute, the extent of that. It's also that it was obliged by treaty and by foreign pressure to follow a certain type of policy, which was very, very important. What we found fascinating in this, however, is the gradual realization that unless something was done with regard to industry, there was no way of shaking off embedded weakness of the Ottoman state in a variety of fields. And we think that this is noticeable in the archival work and in the attitude of the state. And we see it in the local area. The way they treat the original applications, the way they treat subsequent applications, the familiarization they develop with the local industrialists, the connections that are acquired. Obviously, there's corruption at the same time, but certainly there's a greater familiarity with the local bourgeois class. What is equally interesting, though, is the social considerations and the communal considerations that characterize how the Ottoman state behaves. It's interesting. The first application made for the factor that Pinar showed you went through a variety of stages. And one of the main issues that was raised was the use of the water had to be very carefully regulated so that there would be no social tensions, and the output of the plant had to be carefully controlled so that there would not be poverty created in the local town, because of destruction of domestic woolen production. So the state took care that the community in a way would be protected from this novel experiment, indicating also, as is always the case, that when this factory emerged, the community didn't know what to make of it because it was new and it was potentially dangerous. And the state intervened to stabilize things. So I wouldn't call that anti-industrialism. I would say that what they were concerned about was how to minimize and pacify social tensions. Over time, they learned how to do things differently, and they supported industry far more actively, even the provincials, and certainly those in Salonika, and certainly the Jewish capitalists in Salonika, who were far better connected than the Christians.
That's fascinating. Please do think
can I make a point?
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I think we need to say that the nationalism, the rising nationalism in the Balkans is an important point here as well, as Costas also mentioned, because when we see that in 1874, some Greek men, basically, they didn't know what they were doing. The Ottoman state didn't know what they were doing. That's why they asked for so many documents from them in order to show that they're actually capable of running such an industrial plant. At the same time, a specific family, very well-known Jewish family from Salonika, made the application and they got a pass like this with extra concessions. So this shows that the state was not actually anti-industrial, but it had other concerns. Here we should consider the impact of nationalism as well, because the Greeks managed to have an independent state, and that was a problem for the Ottoman state, whereas Jews were always with the Ottoman state. From the perspective of the Ottoman state, I'm saying, so they didn't have an independent state ideal at the time. So the Ottoman state considered them as, friends, whereas the others, the Greeks, should be, kept in a bit, the state had to be a bit careful with them. So that was also an important point here.
Absolutely. I mean, the obvious example in a huge, much bigger scale is contemporary China, where if you become a billionaire, then you watch out. Or indeed, of course, contemporary Russia. But to go back to the earlier question that Costas raised, the absolutely crucial question, whether you can have industrialization in a non-homogeneous society, I think that the Gellnerian answer, the work of Ernest Gellner, would say no. Would say that you really can only get the social mobility that you need to create an industrialized state when you have created homogeneity, and you can either have it, as it were, by accident, perhaps as it was the case in pre-modern Britain, or you can create it artificially, as indeed they did when the Turkish Republic was formed. Society as we have today in Turkey, other than, of course, the occasional economic crises that we see at the moment. But in essence, of course, with the Republic, they managed to create a situation where everybody got primary education and everybody was able to identify if they wanted to as being part of the Turkish Republic. And so the whole point about name Turkum DNA is that means they can become, in effect, part of the industrial process, which is part of the nation state. Now, of course, the Ottoman Empire tried in various ways in a kind of a half-hearted manner without really understanding what was going on, but it wasn't really possible. I mean, this would be what that little theory would say, but I don't know, does that fit in with your thinking, Costas, or would you put a different interpretation on it?
Oh, I think it does. In a way, that's basically what I said. I don't think it's particularly original, but it seems to me that it's true that the more that capitalism developed, and the more that these people were successful in provincial Macedonia or in Salonika, the Jews and so on, and also Christians in Salonika, the more that this happened and society modernized, the more that the working class emerged and capitalist class emerged, and obviously all the accoutrements of modernization emerged, and we began to look recognizably like a European city. I mean, obviously Salonika always was Ottoman, but it began to look like a European city. The more that this happened, the greater the divisions and the more intense the nationalism. That's not accidental. You see, that indicate that the state was trying in a variety of ways, never particularly successfully, and never with full commitment. And in the end, that kind of disarticulation was very noticeable. So no, I don't think they would have done it. In addition, economically speaking, it is debatable that they would have fed the internal organization as a state to bring about the broader economic policies that lies. It's one thing to give tax concessions. That's fine. And you allow private capitalists to do their business. But really, to succeed beyond that, you need to mobilize national forces and national strengths and resources more systematically, a bit like the Japanese did. And I don't think that I'm sure that the Ottoman state had enough internal coherence and organization to be able to do that. And I don't know they would have been allowed to do it, given the power of surrounding Western forces over it. It is an interesting counterfactual issue to consider.
Yeah, it is. Except for nobody has their hand up, but do just jump in. Think about how to jump in. But of course, the development of capitalism in Britain happened almost in spite of the state. The state didn't stop it, but I mean, maybe it's because the state was so mixed up with the empire, and economics was driven, of course, through the empire, and therefore the state didn't have to worry about that too much. And so as the two mingled together, you were able to get the emergence of a mercantile middle class in the 19th century, which the state didn't try to impede because they were helping with the external possessions. I think that would be a nice way of looking at it. But please do.
But Britain was the first. Don't forget.
Well, that's the point. That's the point. And then, but then after that, the states, I guess, have to really try to understand what's going on. And when they do understand, they realize they have to drive it. But I can see. Please, Celia. But go ahead. Well, you're still muted.
I've got to go in about 5 minutes, so I may not be able to hear the whole of the answer. I wanted to ask about the connection with the Kingdom of Greece. I think Pinar explained that was it in the construction of the first factory, second-hand machinery was imported from Greece, and I wondered to what extent they had looked in that direction for models to follow, and even the very idea of sort of moving into modern mechanical production.
It wasn't the first time actually they were making trade with the Kingdom of Greece, because in the previous archives or archival sources before the industrialization, we also see that when they were producing this shayak and abba, these two kinds of woolen cloth, they were actually the main producers of shayak, which is a good quality one. They were also exporting it to the Kingdom of Greece. So the Greeks of the region kept their relations with the Kingdom of Greece. And that's interesting. At the time, they had the information about a failed factory attempt in the Kingdom of Greece. Right. So this shows that there was a constant communication, let's say, channels.
Have there also been successful attempts in the Kingdom of Greece before this happened in Macedonia?
There was, but I mean, I don't think it's a case of a model. It's not that they.
I see.
It's not that. It's just that these processes happen pretty much at the same time. As the European part of the empire begins to modernize and acquire industry and to move into that kind of textile and food and other capitalism, so does the Kingdom of Greece. 30 years after independence, and you begin to get textile factories and that kind. 1860s is the time when it starts, and clearly the links, the trading links and textiles and so on, facilitate this first occurrence in the Ottoman environment. But it's not a case of models. It's more a case of traveling of information, knowledge about what's feasible, and so on. I mean, a lot of the industrialists of now and so on very soon began to send their firstborns and so on to England to be trained and to learn how Accrington worked and to learn how Lancashire worked. You know, so the models were actually abroad. They were not really in Greece.
But at the same time, that's interesting because in the whole Balkans, we see a kind of parallel in these whole small states in terms of when they started, what kind of development. There's a huge parallel in the whole region as well.
Yes. Oh, that's interesting.
The leading country for that is Bulgaria, of course. Bulgaria was ahead.
Yeah. In woolen cloth sector.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid I do have to go now. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sida. Any questions from our remaining colleague? They would like to ask anything? Please don't be shy, even if it's a simple question. I think people have decided that it's time to get their dinner, which is a perfectly reasonable presumption, I think. Well, in that case, let me just thank you on behalf of the Society for a wonderful talk. And
you're welcome.
I should explain that our treasurer, Craig, has recorded it. And so a time when you think it's appropriate, it can be put on our archive and can be watched by future generations, so that they will be able to hear your theories from you speaking yourselves. And so it'll be a very, very nice resource for them. And I myself will read the book as soon as I can get hold of a copy, because I think this is absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much indeed. And you really have given us a great pleasure this evening. So thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you for the invitation. It was
Thank you. And thanks for listening to all the attendees.
And I hope that your book has a great success.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.
Nice.
Bye now.
Good night.